The exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt is one of the foundational events of Christianity. It marked the birth of the nation that would bring forth the Messiah, Jesus Christ, into the world for the redemption of the sins of mankind. It is referred to often within both the Old and New Testaments as a demonstration of God's great power and a revelation of his truth in the face of the man-made religions behind the pagan nations of the ancient world. For all of this, evidence of the events described in the Exodus account, as well as the overall sojourn of the Israelites in ancient Egypt, has proven elusive to find in the historical and archaeological record. Professor Israel Finkelstein, one of the preeminent scholars in ancient Near Eastern chronology, summarizes the contemporary perspective of modern scholarship regarding the Exodus narrative.
The attempts to locate the events in the 13th century BC in the time of Pharaoh Ramses II have faced insurmountable difficulties. There is no mention of such an event in any New Kingdom source. There is no trace of the early Hebrews in Egypt. The northern coast of Sinai was protected by formidable Egyptian forts, which could have easily prevented an escaping people from crossing the desert. There is no trace of late bronze remains in the rest of the Sinai Peninsula, not even in a place like Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites are supposed to have camped for a long time. And Canaan of that time was an Egyptian province administered by Egyptian garrisons, where 50 Egyptian soldiers were enough to pacify an area according to the Amarna letters. Finally, many of the places mentioned in the story of Exodus and the wandering in the desert were not inhabited before the 8th or even 7th centuries BC.
A statement to this effect from such an authority figure as Professor Finkelstein leads many to conclude that the events of the Exodus narrative comprise a fictional story of origins, arranged to give purpose and meaning to the Jewish people during their exile in the city of Babylon, hundreds of years after these events supposedly took place. These views represent the majority perspective among the historical, archaeological, and Egyptological communities, those who write the textbooks that serve as the basis for our education system. It should not be a surprise then when many people educated with these ideas either abandon the faith they were raised with and or maintain an obstinance towards the acceptance of Christianity as an objective truth revealed by God. Looking a little closer at Professor Finkelstein's statement, however, we can identify some assumptions he must affirm in order to make these claims. First, he assumes that the Exodus took place during the 13th century BC. In other words, somewhere between the years 1299 and 1200 before Christ. Specifically, he assumes that Pharaoh Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. He also assumes that the desert the Israelites wandered in for 40 years was the desert of the Sinai Peninsula. These assumptions are not unique to Professor Finkelstein. They are widespread in the academic world. There are also the assumptions behind the various depictions of the Exodus narrative in modern film and television. As a result, many people believe that these are the criteria by which we should be examining the historical and archaeological record for evidence of the Exodus. Thus, if we do not find any evidence within the bounds of these assumptions, then there is no evidence to be found. But what if these assumptions are incorrect? How would this change our perception of the Bible's historicity? Before we simply say that, quote, the attempts to locate the events of the Exodus in the 13th century before Christ in the time of Pharaoh Ramses II have faced insurmountable difficulties, we need to ask the question, is the 13th century before Christ during the reign of Ramses II the proper time to be looking for evidence of the Exodus? What are the criteria behind why so many scholars assume this position? And are there any criterion which would argue against this interpretation of history? In my previous videos, I have argued that the desert the Israelites wandered in was the Arabian desert, not the Sinai desert. If this is correct, then of course we won't find any evidence of late Bronze Age remains in Sinai, because that is the wrong place to look for such remains. Regarding the date of the Exodus, though, there is a similar issue that could be at stake. If the 13th century BC was not the time the Exodus occurred, then of course there is not going to be evidence of it then, because it is the wrong time to be looking in. Before we go any further, though, you may be asking, how do you look in a specific period of time? Rest assured, there is not any secret time travel going on. Briefly, there are a couple of ways to look back in time. Archaeologists utilize stratigraphy, the deposition of different types of sediment over time. As one digs down, different sedimentary layers can be identified as a result of natural and man-made phenomenon, things like floods, eruptions, fires, etc. Each layer corresponds to a given period of time. Within these layers are found various types of remains: pottery, statuary, building materials, and even ancient trash. If you find an artifact in a certain layer, you can rightly assume that the artifact's age is datable to that layer of sediment. In contrast, historians examine ancient records. Writing systems change over time. Even individual languages adopt varying scripts and idioms as things change. For example, say you found a crumpled piece of paper blowing down the street. Upon picking it up and opening it, you read that it is a letter signed by Thomas Jefferson to Benjamin Franklin. Your first thought may be that you've stumbled on an old letter written by one of America's founding fathers. However, as you read closer, you notice that Mr. Jefferson requests Mr. Franklin to follow him on Instagram. Further, even though the paper is old and brown, it is written in 12-point Arial font. These things would tell you that, despite initial appearances, this letter is either a modern forgery, or it is written from a different Thomas Jefferson to a different Benjamin Franklin that are living today. Ancient writings work similarly. If you can identify a particular language, script, writing utensil, writing base, or references to specific people, places, things, or cultural idioms, you can place that record within the greater pool of writings that we have collected and dated. With these methods in mind, once scholars have determined in what time period they should be looking for evidence of the particular event, they can then look at the current body of evidence corresponding to said time period. They can also orient their future research around that time. In order for these methods to be effective, though, it is obvious that the correct time period must be determined in which to look. If we have the wrong time, we will inevitably find no evidence of the event in question. To keep this study digestible, I will break it up over multiple videos. In the next video, we will look at the necessary background information we need to consider in the attempt to date the Exodus. In the previous video, we looked at the assumptions held by modern academic scholarship regarding the date of the events of the Exodus, namely that they took place in the 13th century before Christ, specifically during the reign of Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. We also briefly examined the methods used by scholars to date pieces of evidence of a given event. Before we examine the competing theories regarding the date of the Exodus, there is some important background information that must be understood in order to properly interpret the historical record, both from the Bible and ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptian history is composed of periods called kingdoms. These kingdoms represent times in Egypt when the nation was united under a single ruler, a single pharaoh, or at least a single pharaonic house. There are three major kingdoms recognized by historians: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Each of these kingdoms are separated by what are today referred to as intermediate periods. Intermediate periods are times in Egypt when the nation was divided between competing rulers. Usually, these divisions occurred across northern and southern boundaries, and they are typically the result of a power vacuum and economic instability. The kingdom and intermediate periods are arranged around the rule of particular royal dynasties in Egypt. The Old Kingdom is the rule of dynasties 3 through 6. This is the time period of many of Egypt's signature monuments, such as the Pyramids of Giza and the Great Sphinx. The Middle Kingdom is the rule of dynasties 11 through 13. Finally, the New Kingdom is the rule of dynasties 18 through 20. The time of King Tut, Ramses the Great, and most of what we think of as distinctly ancient Egyptian. The dynasties which ruled during the intermediate periods usually ruled in overlapping or parallel fashion from different portions of Egyptian territory. There are also periods before and after these, referred to specifically as the early dynastic period and the late period. The ancient world did not use absolute systems of dating like we do today. All dating systems back then were relative, usually to whoever the ruling king or emperor was at the time. This means that most of the dates preserved in the historical record are specific to ancient Egypt itself. Scholars are therefore presented with the challenge to accurately construct a record of Egyptian history, and then to apply that history to an absolute dating scheme. Scholars' attempts to do this have resulted in a few competing chronologies, variously referred to as high, middle, and low chronologies, with differences ranging from 5 to 50 years between them in the time periods we are concerned with. I am not in a position to speak on which of these chronological interpretations is most accurate. In general, though, I think it's permissible to allow a limited amount of flexibility when we attempt to date a specific event. The majority of the debate surrounding the date of the Exodus concerns the New Kingdom, specifically dynasties 18 and 19. There is also a minor opinion that suggests the proper time period of Egyptian history for the Exodus is the Middle Kingdom, not the New Kingdom. We will look at each of these interpretations individually. Before we do so, though, we must consider the data the Bible gives regarding the date of the Exodus. We will not attempt to interpret this data just yet. We will do that when we consider each interpretation. The only passage of Scripture that gives a specific date for the Exodus is 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, which reads, "It came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." This verse states that Solomon began constructing the temple in Jerusalem during his 4th regnal year, which was 480 years after, quote, "the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt," the time of the Exodus. While this is the only passage that overtly gives a date, it is not the only passage that needs to be considered. In Judges chapter 11, verse 26, Jephthah is recorded as saying, "While Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Aroer and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years, why did you not recover them within that time?" According to Jephthah's testimony, it appears Israel had been living in the Promised Land for 300 years at the time he gave his speech. When we attempt to identify the date of the Exodus, we should be able to bring this time period into consideration. Within the book of Exodus specifically, Chapter 1, verse 11 tells us that the Israelites were put into forced labor in the construction of 2 store cities, Pithom and Ramses. Though this does not give a date specifically, it does present 2 cities we can identify in the historical record. Presumably, if we can locate the time Pithom and Ramses were in existence, we can extrapolate that time period to the events of the Exodus. There are plenty of other passages of Scripture that we need to bring into the discussion in order to properly interpret and harmonize these passages, and we will seek to do so in the next video when we compare the different dates proposed for the Exodus. However, these are the core verses upon which each proposal is built. In the previous videos, we have identified the assumption of scholarship with regards to dating the Exodus, namely that it is recorded as taking place in the 13th century before Christ, during the reign of Ramses II. We also examined the overall framework of ancient Egyptian chronology and the key Bible passages that point us to the time of the Exodus. As stated previously, the majority of the debate surrounding the date of the Exodus is centered on the 18th and 19th royal dynasties of pharaonic Egypt, during the period historians refer to as the New Kingdom. The reasons for this have to do with the placement of ancient Egyptian chronology in relationship to some absolute dates preserved, or at least implied, within the biblical text. The result of this is that there are 2 major views espoused for the Exodus date. an early date, which places the Exodus during the 18th dynasty, and a late date, which places it in the 19th dynasty. This may seem like a small difference on paper. However, the time period encompassed between the beginning of the 18th and the end of the 19th dynasties is roughly 400 years. Depending on which date a scholar prefers, they will be influenced in one direction or the other by multiple centuries. As I mentioned in the first video of this series, this influence can have huge ramifications when considering the body of historical and archaeological evidence. Artifacts and documents that are offered as proof by one position are disregarded by the other due to conflicting assumptions. Before proceeding, there is one more piece of evidence we need to consider in attempting to identify the date of the Exodus. Ramses II's reign was approximately 65 years, one of the longest pharaonic reigns in all of ancient Egyptian history. As such, he died an old man and actually outlived some of his sons who would have otherwise succeeded him. The prince who finally did succeed Ramses was named Mer-em-Ptah, Ramses' 13th son, himself already an older man when he came to power. For this reason, he only ruled for around 10 years before he died. During his reign, though, Mer-em-Ptah erected a stela recording campaigns, either by himself or his father and grandfather, in Libya and Canaan. Line 26 of this stela contains the phrase, quote, "Israel is laid waste, his seed is not." For this reason, this stela has become widely known as the Israel stela. The reference to Israel that is recorded here is nearly unanimously accepted among Egyptologists. There is some debate, though, as to whether Israel is being credited with national status at this point, or if they are referred to as a group of nomadic wanderers. Regardless, this represents the first documentation of Israel's existence in history by a foreign power. It also acknowledges Israel's existence independent of Egyptian rule or hegemony. For this reason, the Exodus cannot be dated any later than the reign of Mer-em-Ptah, roughly 1210 BC by accepted chronology. We will consider further implications of the Israel stela later, but for now, we can reference it as establishing a fixed boundary, which the Exodus must have occurred prior to. With all of the key pieces of data having been considered, we can now examine the proposals for the date of the Exodus. Let me preface myself by saying that every position must engage in some conjecture to make their arguments. This is not to say that such conjecture is unjustified, but that justification for doing so must be substantiated. Let's start with the argument for the late dating of the Exodus, during the 13th century BC, in the reign of Ramses II. As stated, this is the view held to by the majority of current academic scholarship, so it is the view that you are most likely to see expressed in textbooks, lectures, and mainstream documentaries. The late date view gives priority of interpretation to a straightforward reading of Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, which records the Israelites as having been put into forced labor in the construction of Pithom and Ramses. This verse is a textual variant, as the Septuagint also includes the city of On, commonly known as Heliopolis by Greek authors. However, the Septuagint reading is likely not the original in this case, as the Dead Sea Scrolls do not reflect the addition of Un. While the location of Pithom is somewhat debated, Egyptology has confirmed the existence of the city of Ramses in the Nile Delta region of Egypt, not far from the proposed location of Goshen, the region where Jacob and his family settled when they came to Egypt. This city was one of the many constructed by Ramses II during his long reign as pharaoh. It is likely that Pithom was located nearby, as Ramesside remains have been discovered at other sites in the region, most probably Tel el-Rataba. Remember, though, that this verse is one of three we presented as the main passages pointing to the date of the Exodus. How does this position accord with the other passages? 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 records the Exodus as taking place 480 years before Solomon began to construct the temple in Jerusalem. This verse is also a textual variant. The Septuagint gives a date here of 440 years. We don't know which reading is more likely to be the original, as the Dead Sea Scrolls are not preserved at this portion of Scripture. Regardless, the fourth regnal year of Solomon is almost unanimously accepted at 966 BC. 480 years prior to 966 would be 1446 BC. If the reading of the Septuagint is to be preferred, then 440 years before would be 1406 BC. Herein is where the late date view runs into its first point of conjecture. Ramses II reigned during the 13th century BC, approximately the years 1280 to 1215, around 200 years after the date recorded in 1 Kings chapter 6. Late date proponents therefore argue that the date recorded in this verse should not be regarded as literal, but as symbolic. The argument goes that 480 is a multiple of 12 and 40, two numbers that are emphasized heavily across the Old and New Testaments. It is true that many instances where multiples of these numbers are used are done so with symbolic significance. The argument then proceeds that 40 is the ideal number of years regarded for a generation. Thus, 480 years should be understood as a euphemism for 12 generations. If this assumption is correct, it follows then that most people did not actually live to be 40 years old in the ancient world. So, if the author of 1 Kings is attempting to say 12 generations, a generation should be regarded as something more like 20 to 25 years. This would equal a total time period of 250 to 300 years. This understanding would place the Exodus around approximately 1266 to 1216 BC, during the middle to the end of the reign of Ramses II. With this being said, are there any problems with the late date view of the Exodus? First, if the late date reading of Exodus 1:11 is correct, then it means that Ramses II is the pharaoh who did not know Joseph. This also means that Moses would have been born during the reign of Ramses II and raised in his household, perhaps as one of his many princes. The Exodus itself would have taken place later, perhaps during the reign of Mer-em-Ptah. However, this becomes a problem because Mer-em-Ptah's stela records the autonomous existence of Israel in Canaan during his reign. The Exodus therefore had to have occurred before his time as pharaoh. This means that Ramses II must also be regarded by late-date proponents as the pharaoh of the Exodus. Proposing Ramses II as both the pharaoh who did not know Joseph and the pharaoh of the Exodus has a hard time being reconciled with the biblical testimony. Exodus chapter 2 verse 23 records that, quote, "the king of Egypt died during Moses' years of flight in Midian before he met the angel of the Lord in the burning bush on Mount Sinai." Regarding the late date reading of 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, it is highly, if not entirely, speculative. This is not to say that it is wrong, but that it relies heavily on assumption rather than exegesis of the biblical text. There isn't anything overt in the passage that tells us to interpret 480 years as a symbolic reference. Further, I believe that the presence of a textual variant at this verse actually undermines the symbolic reading of this number. If, quote, 480 years was a reference to 12 generations, how do we account for the reading of 440 years found in the Septuagint? While there is some substance to citing 12 and 40 as ideologically important numbers for the Israelites, the same cannot be said for the number 11. The Septuagint reading being 11 times 40, according to this logic. When attempting to interpret a passage that is a text variant, the interpretation that is likely to be correct should account for each of the variant readings. I don't believe that the symbolic interpretation of 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 does a sufficient job to account for the variant reading found in the Septuagint. The late date view also has some difficulty with Jephthah's testimony, recorded in Judges chapter 11 verse 26, that Moses had led Israel into Ammonite territory 300 years before the time of his speech. Jephthah's lifetime is recorded as approximately 1100 BC, so 300 years prior to his time would have been around 1400 BC, again, too early to coincide with a Ramesside exodus. Further, as Professor Israel Finkelstein mentioned,
the attempts to locate the events in the 13th century BC in the time of Pharaoh Ramses II have faced insurmountable difficulties.
In the next video, we will consider the strengths and weaknesses of the early date of the Exodus. In the previous video, we considered the strengths and weaknesses of the proposal for the late date of the Exodus, that it occurred in the 13th century before Christ, during the reign of Ramses II. As mentioned previously, there is another major position regarding the date of the Exodus. In contrast to the late date proposal, this position is known as the early date proposal. This position is not as prolific among current academic scholarship. However, it tends to have a fair amount of support among biblical scholars and interested laity. Where the late date proposal puts priority of interpretation on a straightforward reading of Exodus chapter 1 verse 11, the early date proposal does so instead with 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1. As I talked about in the second video of this series, 1 Kings 6:1 is the only verse in the Bible that specifically dates the Exodus. The late date proposal regards the time frame recorded in this verse as a euphemism for 12 generations by ancient standards, a total time of 250 to 300 years, to justify a defense of Ramses II as the pharaoh of the Exodus. Recall, though, that one of the weaknesses of the late date interpretation here is that it is mostly based on speculation. With this in mind, early date proponents respond by reading this verse as a plain attempt by the author of 1 Kings to record the amount of time that's passed since the events of the Exodus. What happens if we do this? To recap, the fourth regnal year of Solomon is almost unanimously accepted at 966 BC. 480 years prior to 966 would be 1446 BC. A date in the middle of ancient Egypt's 18th royal dynasty. We must remember, though, that 1 Kings 6:1 is a textual variant, with the Septuagint recording a time frame of 440 years. If the reading of the Septuagint is to be preferred, then 440 years before would be 1406 BC, still in the middle of the 18th dynasty. While either of these dates are far too early to accord with the Exodus taking place during the reign of Ramses II, which of these dates is the correct one? The short answer is that we can't be absolutely sure either way. Normally, in instances like this, we would examine the reading of the Dead Sea Scrolls to help break the stalemate. In the case of 1 Kings 6:1, though, the Dead Sea Scrolls have not been preserved at this portion of Scripture. Until another manuscript is discovered, the attempts to give priority to one reading over the other are speculative. Personally, I believe that the discrepancy between 480 and 440 is probably the result of different scribal attempts to provide a round number for how much time had elapsed between Solomon and the Exodus. Some may be inclined to argue for either of these dates as being exact, but I am okay with understanding them as being rounded figures. Thus, if evidence for the Exodus can be offered between or around this range of dates, say roughly 1450 to 1400 BC, I believe we have limited freedom to pursue the most compelling examples rather than trying to nitpick at 1 or 2 decades here or there. Proposing a date for the Exodus between the middle to the end of the 15th century before Christ seems to accord well with Jephthah's testimony, recorded in Judges 11:26, that Moses had led Israel into Ammonite territory 300 years before the time of his speech. Jephthah's lifetime is regarded as approximately 1100 BC. 300 years prior to Jephthah's time would be around 1400 BC. Again, I am okay with reading 300 here as a rounded number. Acknowledging that Moses' conquest of the Ammonites occurred toward the end of the 40 years wandering in the desert, we can therefore add on a few more decades to Jephthah's, quote, 300 years, to arrive at an approximate date for the Exodus itself. Doing so brings us into the time frame established by the variant readings of 1 Kings 6:1. Having said this much, late date proponents argue that a weak point of the early date proposal is that it does not match with a straightforward reading of Exodus chapter 1 verse 11, which records the Israelites as having been put into forced labor in the construction of Pithom and Ramses. The city of Ramses was constructed during the reign of Ramses II, from whom the city got its name. If the Exodus occurred between 1450 and 1400 BC, it would be around 200 years too early to have the Israelites be forced to build this city. This is where the roles reverse. The late date employs some conjecture at 1 Kings 6:1. The early date, however, does so here at Exodus 1:11. While it is true that the city of Ramses was constructed in the 13th century BC rather than the 15th century BC, there was, in fact, an older city that existed in nearly the same location as Ramses in the 15th century BC. That city is known as Avaris. The response of early date proponents regarding the record of Ramses in Exodus 1:11 is that this was probably not the original reading of this verse. Rather, that Ramses is an updated toponym or place name for Avaris, which was redacted for a later Israelite audience. We must acknowledge that there isn't anything in the context of Exodus 1 that would demand the text to be understood in this way, so this proposal is based on some assumption. But there is an interesting point to consider from Genesis. Genesis chapter 47 records the dialogue between the pharaoh of Joseph and Jacob when Jacob's family came to settle in Egypt. Verses 4 and 6 record the place of Israelite settlement as, quote, the land of Goshen. Verse 11 then records that, quote, Joseph settled his father and brothers in the land of Egypt, and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. For all of the opposition that has been raised by proponents of a late date for the Exodus over the city of Ramses in Exodus 1:11 being a redaction for Avaris, it certainly appears that this is exactly what has been done here in Genesis 47:11. Everybody acknowledges that Jacob and Joseph lived a long time before Ramses II. So it is impossible that they settled in any place named Ramses. However, as stated, there were places in the region Ramses would later occupy where Semitic settlements have been discovered. Late date proponents argue that these settlements should not be equivocated with the settlement of the Israelites, because they are centuries too early to coincide with a Ramesside exodus. However, if Ramses II was not the pharaoh of the Exodus, and it was instead a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, then the case for these settlements being Israelite settlements becomes much more intriguing. Personally, I believe that the assumption that the city of Ramses in Exodus 1:11 is a redacted place name for Avaris or another nearby location has more warrant than assuming the date in 1 Kings 6:1 is a euphemism for 12 generations. Given also the documentation of Israel in Canaan during the reign of Merom-Ptah, I also believe that the timeline for an early date makes more sense than with a late date. Setting the Exodus somewhere around the middle to the end of the 15th century BC allows for Israel to complete their wandering in the desert, to finish their conquest under Joshua, and become established in the region by the time Meremtah's stela was produced. Setting the Exodus 200 years later, during the reign of Ramses II, simply does not allow for all of this to happen in time. Some scholars object to this by arguing that Meremtah's stela records Israel as a people group rather than a state. Substance to this charge is the determinative hieroglyph for people. Thus, such scholars argue that the Israel of Meremtah's stela should be understood as a nomadic group of wanderers. I am not an authority on hieroglyphs, so I can't speak to them one way or the other. What I would say, though, is that the documentation of Israel in the context of the other Canaanite city-states at this point in time should account for their autonomy as being comparable to that of the other locations listed. Whether the Egyptians of Meremtah's day regarded Israel as a people group or a state is second to the respect given to them as a Canaanite locale. Further, if there is any credibility to the destruction brought on Egypt during the 10 plagues and the drowning of Pharaoh's army, then it is highly unlikely that Meremtah would have had the economic and military power to engage in the battles that he did if his father, Ramses II, was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Proposing an Exodus date in the 15th century BC allows some 200 years for Egypt to gradually recover and reestablish itself as a major power in the ancient Near East. These are the two major biblical arguments for the date of the Exodus. In the next video, though, we will examine some interesting circumstantial evidence that could help us further identify the time frame in which all of these events took place. In the previous videos, we have examined the two major proposals for the date of the Exodus. The late date proposal, which places the Exodus in ancient Egypt's 19th dynasty, and the early date proposal, which places it approximately 200 years earlier during the 18th dynasty. While we have looked at most of the direct evidence thus far, I want to take the opportunity in this video to look at some interesting circumstantial evidence from ancient Egypt that I believe can be useful in helping to identify not only the date of the Exodus, but also its historical reality more broadly. The first thing worth examining is actually the name of the man God used to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses. Historically, the belief among Jews and Christians has been that Moses authored the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Some discussion has persisted over whether Moses wrote these books directly or if he authored them by commission. Regardless, the idea that Moses was involved in producing this body of text has been an instrumental part of understanding the Bible. In the last couple of centuries, though, the view has become more popular that Moses was not the author of the Torah, rather that these books are compilations of different authors from later dates in Israel's history, with most proponents pointing to the time of the Babylonian exile as the most likely time. This position is known as the documentary hypothesis, or JEDP, an acrostic for the assumed authorial sources. The rise of this position has not only raised skepticism about Moses' authorship of the Torah, but also about the historical credibility of the Torah as a whole, including Moses' existence. I don't intend to get into a detailed examination of the Torah's authorship here. However, one of the important things we can take away from the Exodus narrative relative to ancient Egyptian history is just how common the name Moses was during the 18th and 19th dynasties. Many 18th and 19th dynasty pharaohs have Moses incorporated into their names. The Egyptian word translated as Moses is Misi, which means to give birth, or born of. According to Professor James Hoffmeyer, there is widespread agreement that at the root of the name of the great Hebrew leader is the Egyptian word Misi, which was a very common element in the theophoric names throughout the New Kingdom. As Hoffmeyer has presented, this word is actually present in the name Ramses. Thus, an alternative rendering of his name would be Ramoses. A legitimate question that should be asked of those scholars who maintain that the Torah is fiction or mythology, based on the assumption that it was compiled from various authors at a time in Israel's history long after these events supposedly took place, is: how did Jewish scribes in Babylon just happen to give their leader a name that was contemporary with the time and place of his supposed existence if they just made him up? In fact, Hofmeyr has identified 6 terms in Moses' birth story that have Egyptian origins or influences dating back to the New Kingdom period. It seems unlikely that scribes writing in Babylon nearly 1,000 years later would get these terms right by mere coincidence. The presence of the name Moses, as well as these other Egyptian cognate words, points to the book of Exodus as being a product of the time when the events it recalls took place. Along similar lines, one of the points of frustration for Bible scholars through history has been the lack of any name associated with the pharaohs recorded in Genesis and Exodus. Our efforts to document the Exodus would be greatly helped if the names of the pharaohs of Abraham, Joseph, the oppression, and the Exodus were written down. Again, skeptics of the Bible point to the lack of any pharaonic name in these texts as evidence of them being fiction or mythology. However, Hofmeyr makes an interesting observation relative to the Bible's lack of any pharaonic name in these passages. Throughout Genesis and Exodus, the well-known title Pharaoh is used. As a reference to the palace, this expression goes back to the Old Kingdom. But as an epithet for the monarch, it does not occur until the 18th dynasty, sometime before the reign of Thutmose III. From its inception until the 10th century, the term pharaoh stood alone, without a juxtaposed personal name. In subsequent periods, the name of the monarch was generally added on. This practice is found in the Old Testament. In the period covered from Genesis and Exodus to Solomon and Rehoboam, the term pharaoh occurs alone, while after Shishak, the title and name appear together. Thus, the usage of pharaoh in Genesis and Exodus does accord well with the Egyptian practice from the 15th through the 10th centuries. The appearance of pharaoh in the Joseph story could reflect the New Kingdom setting of the story, or, if its provenance is earlier, the late Middle Kingdom through the Second Intermediate period, its occurrence in Genesis is suggestive of its period of composition. For all of the frustration that the anonymity of the Genesis and Exodus pharaohs has caused, it happens that the practice of not recording their name is evidence of these books having been written down during the time of the events they record, rather than at a later date by scribes removed in time and location. Rather than being cause for skepticism, the lack of pharaonic names here is actually substance to biblical authenticity. Something that has been very interesting to me in my studies of Israel's time in Egypt and the Exodus narrative is that in the time period established between the early date and the late date proposals is the presence of Egypt's most enigmatic pharaoh, Akhenaten. Briefly, Akhenaten's claim to fame is that he is the one ruler in all of ancient Egyptian history who championed monotheism, the belief in and worship of one god. In an unprecedented move, this pharaoh effectively threw away the rest of the Egyptian pantheon during his reign and established a new state religion around the Aten, a sun god. There are many books and documentaries that have been produced about Akhenaten, so I will direct those interested in him to pursue those works. The reasons for Akhenaten's religious upheaval have been and continue to be shrouded in ambiguity. He is generally regarded by historians and archaeologists as the world's first monotheist. As such, many scholars regard his reign as being of influence on Moses and the early Israelites, if they are even willing to acknowledge Moses as a historical figure at all. For our purposes, this possibility could be considered if the Exodus occurred at the proposed late date, as Ramses II reigned roughly 100 years after Akhenaten. However, if we propose the early date for the Exodus, sometime between or around 1450 to 1400 BC, something really interesting happens. By most ancient Egyptian chronological assessments, 1450 to 1400 BC encompasses portions of the reigns of 2 to 3 pharaohs: Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and, possibly, Thutmose IV. Akhenaten's reign began around roughly 1350 BC. If the events of the Exodus, namely the economic collapse of the Egyptian state and the destruction of Pharaoh's army, occurred between 50 to 100 years before his reign, it is safe to say that Egypt would have been reeling during this time to try to build itself back into a major power. It would also be wrestling with the fact that their gods proved no match to the one God of Israel. Thus, if an early date of the Exodus is to be favored, the possibility arises that Akhenaten's pagan monotheism was not unprecedented. Rather, that it may have been a reaction to the destruction and humiliation brought on Egypt in the Exodus. Instead of being the first monotheist, Akhenaten could have been attempting to either appease Israel's God, albeit ignorantly, or he was appealing to another deity who he believed would better protect Egypt in the future. Akhenaten's religious activities are not the only thing that his reign contributed to the study of the Exodus. During his time as pharaoh, Akhenaten established a new capital city called Akhetaten, which is now known as the site of Tel El Amarna. Discovered at this site was a large cache of cuneiform tablets recording correspondence between the Egyptian royal court and their contemporaries. These tablets are known today as the Amarna letters. During the 18th dynasty, Egypt maintained hegemony over many of the city-states of Canaan and the Levant, the area now encompassed by modern Israel-Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. A portion of the Amarna letters are communication from Egypt's vassal states requesting military aid in the face of attacks by a group referred to by the Egyptians as the, quote, Habiru, and the Mesopotamians as the, quote, Apiru. Since the discovery of the Amarna letters, more than a few people have postulated a relation between the Habiru and the Hebrews during their conquest. The military activity recorded in the Amarna letters bears a generic resemblance to the exploits recorded in the Bible under the latter years of Moses and Joshua. As a term, Habiru or Apiru was used to refer to a social class of marauding people living outside of urban areas, usually with a reputation for pillaging said areas. While the designation of Habiru or Apiru appears to have been used in reference to a wide array of groups, the wandering Hebrews under Moses and Joshua could certainly be considered Habiru based on their activity. Though it once garnered more popularity, the association of the Habiru or Apiru with the Hebrews has fallen out of favor among more recent scholarship, largely due to the assumption that the Exodus occurred at the late date, during the reign of Ramses II. But, again, if the early date of the Exodus is to be favored, then the possibility arises that the Habiru of the Amarna letters correspond to the Hebrew conquest recorded in the Bible. One of the biggest issues scholars face in placing the Exodus in history is a lack of Egyptian records of the events recorded in the biblical narrative. This isn't necessarily a cause for concern, as pharaonic Egypt engaged in a large amount of propaganda, so it is unlikely that they would document their humiliation at the hands of Yahweh on a stela or temple walls. But, if the Egyptians did not record the Exodus from their perspective, is there anything we can look for in Egypt that would give credibility to the Exodus account? The answer is yes, and we will examine those criteria in the next video. In the previous videos, we establish the arguments for the two major proposals regarding the date of the Exodus. The late date proposal, which places the Exodus in ancient Egypt's 19th dynasty, and the early date proposal, which places it approximately 200 years earlier during the 18th dynasty. We've also finished examining some very interesting circumstantial evidence relative to the Exodus narrative in ancient Egyptian history, such as the frequency of the name Moses during the New Kingdom, the presence of Egyptian cognate words in Exodus, the rise of Akhenaten's pagan monotheism, and the mention of the Habiru in the Amarna letters. As mentioned previously, one of the biggest issues scholars face in placing the Exodus in history is a lack of Egyptian records of the events recorded in the biblical narrative. This lack of any Egyptian documentation has only furthered the debate over the date of the Exodus. In light of this, we concluded by asking if there is anything we can look for in Egypt that would give credibility to the Exodus account. The answer is yes. Perhaps the two things that the Exodus is most famous for are the 10 plagues God brought on Egypt for refusing to let the Israelites go, and the miraculous crossing of the Israelites through the Yam Suf, the Red Sea, which resulted in the drowning of Pharaoh's army. If we are going to regard the Exodus narrative seriously, then there are two major consequences that we can look for in the historical record. Number one, the economic collapse of the Egyptian state, and number two, a period of Egyptian military weakness. The economic collapse of Egypt would be the result of both having lost a substantial labor force in Hebrew slavery and the destruction of people and property by the plagues. The military weakness would be the result of the entire royal army having been drowned, or at least a major portion of it. These two phenomena present an opportunity for us to establish a synchronism. A synchronism is something that is attested among multiple sources. In the second video of this series, I gave an overview of ancient Egyptian chronology. Recall that ancient Egyptian chronology is, for the most part, a relative chronology. That is, it is organized in relation to events specific to Egypt, usually the reigns of individual pharaohs. The challenge for scholars is to fix this relative chronology to an absolute dating scheme. The foundation for doing this is to look for synchronisms in the historical and archaeological records. With regards to the Bible, one of the most accepted synchronisms is the campaign of Pharaoh Shoshank, presumably recorded in the Bible as Shishak in 1 Kings chapter 14 and 2 Chronicles chapter 12. The Bible describes Shishak as attacking Jerusalem in the 5th year of Rehoboam, Solomon's son. Rehoboam is thought to have come to power around 930 BC. The 5th year of his reign would therefore be 925 BC. Egyptian records of Shoshank document this pharaoh's campaigns in Canaan. The similarities between the names of Shishak and Shoshank, as well as the documentation of both kings' military activities in and around Canaan, Israel, and Judah, has been satisfactory for most scholars to consider this a synchronism. As a result, when scholars build out the surrounding Egyptian and biblical chronology, they can reference this fixed point. Returning to the Exodus specifically, the lack of Egyptian documentation does not allow for us to establish a synchronism with the Bible on textual grounds. However, recognizing the inevitable consequences of the Exodus, if the Bible's testimony is to be taken seriously, we could establish a synchronism, and by extension a fixed date, if we can identify an economic and military collapse of Egypt during the time frame suggested by the Scriptures. Thus, a rather simple solution presents itself to the question of the date of the Exodus. Take the earliest possible date and the latest possible date, and look for a time when Egypt experienced both economic and military collapse. At this point, though, we run into a bit of a hurdle. The New Kingdom is widely considered to be the most powerful and affluent time in pharaonic Egypt. The 18th dynasty pharaohs Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and Thutmose IV were able to expand Egyptian hegemony up through Canaan and Syria, even so far as the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. These territorial gains were fixed with a treaty between Thutmose IV and Artatama I, the king of Egypt's rival state at this time, the Kingdom of the Mitanni. This territorial expansion was unprecedented and was only possible due to the strength and wealth of Egypt during the 18th dynasty. Egyptian influence in the Levant would largely be reestablished during the reigns of the early 19th dynasty pharaohs, Ramses I, Seti I, and Ramses II, culminating in another Egyptian peace treaty, this time with their new rival, the Hittites, following the Battle of Kadesh during the reign of Ramses II. Again, these territories could not have been subdued had it not been for a thriving Egyptian state. However, if we plot these two periods of conquest on our timeline, we observe that there are around 100 years in between these two periods of expansion. What happened during this time that resulted in the Egyptians having to reacquire their territories in the Levant? The pharaohs who ruled during this roughly 100-year period are as follows: Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, whom we have previously met, perhaps the most famous pharaoh of all, Tutankhamun, and Horemheb. With consideration specifically to Akhenaten, we see that the testimony of the Amarna letters during his reign documents the presence of a group known as the Habiru, attacking Egyptian vassal states in Canaan. With respect to these documents, they also indirectly testify to one of two phenomena during the reign of Akhenaten. Number one, that Akhenaten's foreign policy was so apathetic that he did not care to address the concerns of his allies, or number two, the strength of Egypt's military during Akhenaten's reign was too weak for him to support his allies. Like his religious upheaval, the reasons for Akhenaten's disregard for Egyptian allies in the Levant have been and continue to be shrouded in ambiguity. Many scholars, for lack of any other explanation, favor the former idea, citing Akhenaten's religious zeal as a source of tunnel vision that blinded him to the needs outside of his court. However, this rationale is highly speculative. Because of this, I believe it is at least reasonable, if not flat out warranted, that scholars should consider the possibility that Egypt's military was too weak to render a defense of their Canaanite vassals at this time. Indeed, during Akhenaten's reign, Egypt's new ally, the Kingdom of Mitanni, began to be devastated by their common enemy, the Kingdom of Hatti, known to the authors of the Bible as the Hittites. Egypt and Mitanni were the two superpowers of the ancient Near East. The allegiance of these two kingdoms represented a near monopoly of this region, as any form of outside competition toward one would have invoked the full military aid of the other. This understanding is revealed in other documents of the Amarna letters, sent from the Mitanni king Tushratta to Akhenaten. However, the testimony of these letters is that help from Egypt never came. In fact, the Hittite king Suppiluliuma sacked the Mitanni capital of Washukani and annexed former Egypto-Mitanni territory in the Levant. This campaign effectively ended the Mitanni hegemony in the ancient Near East, and would be the genesis of their final collapse in the near future. Through all of this, Egypt did nothing to respond to their Mitanni allies, or to even preserve their own territorial holdings from incursions by the Hittites. Why? Though this series of events is outside of the periphery of the Bible, it is important to consider due to its evidence of Egypt's state of affairs. I believe it is absurd to cite complacency or blind apathy on the part of the Egyptian royal court as the reason for this lack of action. For around 150 years prior, it was considered almost obligatory by the 18th dynasty pharaohs to maintain a northern border at the Euphrates River, and to flex their imperial might against any and all types of competition and dissension in the Levant. Through the reign of Thutmose IV, Egypt was the most powerful, most wealthy nation in this part of the world. They had more gold than they knew what to do with, and they had an army that refused to come in second place. Yet, In the space of merely 2 pharaonic reigns, Egypt has become a weak, apathetic state, unwilling or unable to even defend its own territories, much less uphold those of its allies. Moreover, Egypt's public perception at this time is such that a hostile king feels free to launch multiple attacks against Egypt's ally and vassals without fear of reprisals. For all of this, the Egyptian testimony is near silent. What happened to Egypt between the reign of Thutmose IV and Akhenaten that would result in this incredible power shift? The death of Thutmose IV was apparently premature. Examination of his mummy has led scholars to assume a time of death between 25 and 28 years of age, free from indications of disease or trauma. The result is that his successor, Amenhotep III, likely came to power as a child, evidenced by his long reign of 38 years. If this is the case, then the early years of his reign would most probably have been overseen by other high court officials, perhaps his mother and/or one of the viziers of his father, Thutmose IV. It's during this time that the power shift begins to take place. As rebellions typical of the Levant begin to spring up, Amenhotep III does nothing to suppress them, effectively withdrawing Egyptian hegemony in the region. This policy would persist and degrade to its fullest expression in the subsequent reign of his son, Akhenaten. To be fair, Amenhotep III's reign was remembered domestically as one of peace and prosperity. However, the lack of activity in the Levant has brought some Egyptologists to regard this peace and prosperity as less than the ancient Egyptians have cracked it up to be. Although Amenhotep III inherits the greatest world power of his day, he does little to preserve it. Indeed, as R. Givian recognizes, his rule heralds a weakening of Egypt's position in the world. Further, A. Gardner reminds us that it is wrong to regard Akhenaten as the sole pharaoh responsible for the loss of Egyptian prestige, for Amenhotep III was at least equally to blame. Unlike his imperial forebears, Amenhotep's colonial government is lax in the extreme. From this point on, Amenhotep lapses into the lethargic and voluptuous existence of an oriental despot, degenerating into a senile voluptuary, who, for some unknown reason, is unwilling or unable to address the deteriorating situation in Egypt's Asiatic territories. Given the highly propagandistic tendencies of the pharaonic courts, it is plausible that much of what was communicated about Amenhotep III, or remembered of him by future Egyptians, was not an accurate picture of Egyptian stability. Living off of the spoils and influence of his predecessors, the once mighty 18th dynasty of Egypt begins a rapid decline over the course of his reign. A curiosity that shows up during Amenhotep's reign is the increased deference to the Aten, the deity that would later be given exaltation as the one true god of Egypt during the reign of Akhenaten. In the previous video, I put forth the possibility that Akhenaten's religious activity may have been a reaction to the destruction and humiliation brought on Egypt in the Exodus, if the early date of the Exodus is to be favored. If this understanding is correct, then we must extrapolate that reasoning back into Amenhotep's reign. Though he did not go so far as his son would, perhaps Amenhotep's increasing deference to the Aten was a similar result of an event or sequence of events that demonstrated the impotence of Egypt's more traditional gods. So what do we have at this point? By the end of the reign of Thutmose IV, Egypt is the power in the ancient Near East, rivaled only by the kingdom of Mitanni, who is now Egypt's #1 ally. By the reign of Akhenaten, Egypt is an apathetic, impotent also-ran on the world stage, with their #1 ally on the edge of total destruction. Most of this degradation having taken place during the reign of Amenhotep III between them. With consideration to this pool of data, it is more than reasonable to say that something devastating happened to Egypt either at the end of the reign of Thutmose IV or at the very beginning of the reign of Amenhotep III. By most chronologies, this time is awfully close to the time frame established for the early date of the Exodus by the variant readings of 1 Kings 6:1. Given the flexibility present in the reconstructions of Egyptian chronology, we must consider that this event or sequence of events, whatever it was, actually did occur in the time frame of the early date proposals. Thus, the obvious question is, was the Exodus the event that resulted in the collapse of ancient Egypt's 18th dynasty? But before we consider that, we also need to see if there is a breakdown of Egyptian power and influence around the late date proposal, specifically in the beginning of the 19th dynasty, prior to the reign of Mer-em-Ptah. The 19th dynasty began with the reign of Ramses I. By this time, Egypt was trending upwards from the low point of the end of the 18th dynasty. Ramses I only reigned for a few years before he was succeeded by his son, Seti I. Seti reigned for around 10 years, but during his time, Egypt began to reestablish its holdings in the Levant. Seti was then succeeded by his son, Ramses II, the proposed pharaoh for the late date of the Exodus. As mentioned previously, Ramses II's reign lasted approximately 65 years. His reign saw more expansion, wealth, and influence than any since the beginning of the reign of Amenhotep III. It was during Ramses II's reign that Egypt would garner enough military power to put a stop to the expansion of the now imperial Hittites, the same Hittites who destroyed Mitanni during the reign of Akhenaten. This results in another major alliance following the Battle of Kadesh. By the time Mer-em-Ptah comes to power, Egypt enjoys renewed prominence, with the kingdom of Hatti over the ancient Near East. When we consider the inevitable consequences of the Exodus, there is simply no evidence for any economic or military weakness during or in the wake of Ramses II's reign. I believe this is the nail in the coffin for the late date proposal. To propose the Exodus during the reign of Ramses II inevitably results in the compromise of the Bible's testimony to accord it with the historical record. This is the reason why so many scholars today downplay the Exodus narrative. Egypt was simply too powerful and too wealthy during the reign of Ramses II for the biblical account to accord with this time period. Rather than reconsidering their dating of the Exodus, scholars instead question the veracity of the Bible, interpreting the text in such a way as to make the account fit with their assumptions. I sincerely believe that if we are going to take the Bible seriously, an early date proposal in or around 1450 to 1400 BC is the only reasonable option. It just so happens that when we do this, the inevitable consequences of the Exodus lead to a time in Egypt that is remembered as weak, apathetic, and embarrassing by future Egyptians. What are the odds that these events are not synonymous? This is the theory put forth by Stephen Collins in his book, Let My People Go. In the last few years, however, there has been a popular documentary released called Patterns of Evidence, which proposes another theory that we have yet to explore, that the early date of the Exodus of around 1450 to 1400 BC coincides not with ancient Egypt's 18th dynasty, but rather with the Middle Kingdom. What are the strengths and weaknesses of assigning a Middle Kingdom date for the Exodus rather than an 18th dynasty date? We will examine some of these in the next video. In the previous video, we attempted to identify a time in Egypt that paralleled the inevitable consequences of the Exodus, one in which Egypt was economically and militarily weak. I gave a summation of the events that surrounded the fall of the 18th dynasty, beginning in the reign of Amenhotep III and extending through the reign of Akhenaten and his successors. We concluded by asking if the Exodus was the event responsible for Egypt's loss of prestige during this time. The lack of any evidence to support such a loss of power and influence during the early 19th dynasty, prior to the reign of Merenptah, proves, I believe, devastating to any attempt to advocate a late-date hypothesis for the Exodus. Thus, the remainder of this series will focus on those proposals that involve an early-date hypothesis. Before proceeding, though, there is another theory that we have yet to explore: that the early date of the Exodus of around 1450 to 1400 BC coincides not with ancient Egypt's 18th dynasty, but rather with the Middle Kingdom. This is the view championed in the popular documentary Patterns of Evidence. What are the strengths and weaknesses of assigning a Middle Kingdom date for the Exodus rather than an 18th dynasty date? While Patterns of Evidence features the perspectives of many scholars, the film is primarily oriented around the work of David Rohl, an Egyptologist that some in mainstream scholarship would consider, quote, fringe. The primary charge of Rohl and those who would agree with him is that ancient Egyptian chronology has been improperly reconstructed in the last roughly 200 years that the science of Egyptology has existed, a position known as revised chronology. As a result, biblical archaeologists and Egyptologists have been looking in the wrong time period, in other words, the 13th century BC, for evidence of the events recorded in the biblical narrative. This charge is similar to what I have proposed in this series of videos. However, in certain ways, it is also very different. I will be the first to say that I have much more research to do to become more adequately acquainted with the revised chronological position and the work of David Rohl specifically, right, wrong, or otherwise. As such, I will be offering a limited interaction with his views for the purpose of this video. In the future, I intend to offer more in-depth interaction once I have a better grasp of his arguments. Let me say that Patterns of Evidence is a very well-made film. It's one of the most well-produced documentaries on the Exodus, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with its conclusions. There are two things that the film does that I appreciate. One, it brings together a large portion of the authorities of each position, and two, it raises some important questions with respect to the traditional assumptions found within scholarship. For these reasons, I believe the film, as well as its sequels, are worth watching for anyone interested in the question of the date of the Exodus. Most of Patterns of Evidence concentrates on the period of the Israelite sojourn, as well as the conquest of Jericho. Again, I will offer extended opinions on these subjects in the future. For now, I want to concentrate on the film's proposal for an Exodus date during ancient Egypt's Middle Kingdom. As previously stated, Patterns of Evidence takes up the arguments of David Rohl and other revised chronologists that ancient Egyptian chronology has not been accurately reconstructed. This results in the events of the Exodus being dated to a much earlier time in Egypt's history, though not an earlier absolute date. The main substance to this assertion is that the synchronisms used to fix Egyptian chronology to absolute dates are incorrect. Specifically, the synchronism of the biblical Shishak with the Egyptian pharaoh Shoshenq I. We looked briefly at this purported synchronism in the last video. To recap, the similarities between the names of Shishak and Shoshenq, as well as the documentation of both kings' military activities in and around Canaan, Israel, and Judah, has been satisfactory for most scholars to consider this a synchronism. David Rohl and those who would agree with him, however, disagree. The main reasons for their disagreement are inconsistencies between the military record of Shishak in 1 Kings chapter 14 and 2 Chronicles chapter 12, and those of Shoshenq I in temple inscriptions at Karnak in Egypt. The Bible describes Shishak as attacking Jerusalem in the 5th year of Rehoboam, Solomon's son. Shoshenq's records, however, do not record any campaign against Jerusalem. His records do record other locales in Canaan and Israel, but there is no mention of Jerusalem. To be fair, other mainstream scholars have recognized this and offered proposed solutions to reconcile the Egyptian and biblical accounts. The solution for Roll and other revised chronologists, though, is that the identification of Shishak and Shoshenq is a mistake. The result of this, then, is that Shoshenq should not be regarded as a contemporary of Rehoboam, which means that the surrounding Egyptian chronology of this period would need to be reestablished with the Bible. I don't want to overstep my bounds here, but I agree that the discontinuity between the biblical Shishak and the Egyptian Shoshenq should bring some pause to any definitive attempts to link these two figures together. Surely any activity against Jerusalem that resulted in the subjugation of the city would have been recalled by the Egyptians, especially in the wake of the united monarchy of Solomon. That Shoshenq does not record any mention of Jerusalem is a red flag. The fallout that is proposed by David Roll from this purportedly mistaken synchronism is that Egyptology has grossly overestimated the amount of time in the Third Intermediate Period, the time in Egypt when Shoshenq and Rehoboam were on the throne by conventional chronologies. As I mentioned in the second video of this series, intermediate periods are times in Egypt when the nation was divided between competing rulers. Usually these divisions occurred across northern and southern boundaries, and they are typically the result of a power vacuum and economic instability. The intermediate periods are infamous for being hard to piece together, due to the amount of overlap and competition taking place in Egypt. Roll and other revised chronologists believe that there has been too much time allotted to the Third Intermediate Period. If they are correct, then they maintain that the whole of Egyptian chronology prior to the Third Intermediate Period must be brought forward in time relative to absolute dates. For Roll, this means that the New Kingdom of Egypt now becomes contemporary with the united monarchy of Saul, David, and Solomon, as well as the early years of the divided monarchy. Proceeding back to the 1450 to 1400 BC period in this new chronology reveals that it is now contemporary with ancient Egypt's Middle Kingdom, not the 18th dynasty as in conventional chronology. Roll and other revised chronologists, therefore, concentrate their research on the Israelite sojourn and the Exodus in this period of Egyptian history. Roll believes there is compelling evidence in the Middle Kingdom to substantiate the narrative of the sojourn and the Exodus. While I agree that there are some interesting similarities between the biblical account and the archaeology of the Middle Kingdom, most, if not all of it, is circumstantial. I don't necessarily mean that it is wrong, just that there isn't anything to definitively prove that the events of the Middle Kingdom are the same as the ones recorded in the Bible. Regardless, I believe further study needs to be continually made by all interested parties. Again, I intend to offer more in-depth interaction on Joseph, the sojourn, and Egypt in future videos. While I do have some skepticism about linking Shishak with Shoshenq, I'm not sold on the idea that Egyptian chronology is in error by multiple centuries. My reasons for this are that I think to propose such an idea creates more problems than it solves with respect to Egypt's relations with other nations. I'm aware that revised chronologists have offered some propositions to solve these problems, but I need to become more familiar with them before I can offer a better opinion. For the time being, I still hold to a traditional chronology of ancient Egypt, with the acknowledged margin of error between the high and low reconstructions. I believe also that Roll downplays some of the good evidence that points to an 18th dynasty setting of the Exodus. You can review my presentations of that evidence in the previous two videos of this series. With all of that being said, there are two interesting propositions that result from a revised chronological view of the Exodus. First, one of the curiosities that modern Bible scholars and Egyptologists have faced is that the campaign recorded on Merimtau's victory stela against Israel is not recorded in the Bible. By conventional chronology, this campaign would have been during the time of the Israelite judges, but the book of Judges makes no mention of any Egyptian campaign to this effect. If the revised chronological position of a Middle Kingdom exodus is assumed, the possibility arises that the campaign of Merimtau's stela is actually the campaign of Shishak. This would mean that Shishak corresponds with either Seti I, Ramses II, or Merimtau, rather than with Shoshenq I. One reason to object to this, though, is that if Merimtau's stela is recording Shishak's campaign against Rehoboam, why is there no mention of Judah or Jerusalem? I can anticipate what some rebuttals to this might be, but the lack of mention of Judah or Jerusalem prevents me from linking Merimtau's stela with the campaign of Shishak. Nonetheless, the Bible's silence about the campaign recorded on this stela is still puzzling. The second proposal that I find interesting is that, assuming a Middle Kingdom date of the Exodus, that the Exodus may have been the event that resulted in the collapse of the Middle Kingdom, ushering in the Second Intermediate Period. While I have proposed that the Exodus resulted in the downfall of the 18th dynasty, as evidenced by Egypt's loss of Syro-Canaanite territory and the destruction of the kingdom of Mitanni, I think it is legitimate to ask the question, is that the extent of the collapse that we would expect from the Exodus? Proposing a Middle Kingdom date for the Exodus puts forth the possibility that the consequences of the Exodus resulted in the disintegration of Egypt's central government, not just in its colonial territories. There is more that can be said for both arguments here, but I did want to take a moment to at least acknowledge this. As attractive as this proposal is, I believe the greater context of the downfall of the 18th dynasty is more favorable to the biblical narrative. A Middle Kingdom exodus doesn't as easily reconcile with the Habiru of the Amarna letters, nor does it result in the religious upheaval we see under Akhenaten. I appreciate the questions raised by Patterns of Evidence, David Rohl, and other revised chronologists. I don't think they should all be dismissed offhand. However, at this point, I think they go unnecessarily far in making their case for a Middle Kingdom date of the Exodus. With all of this being said, I will proceed in this series assuming a traditional early date during the 18th dynasty as the most likely for the Exodus. Given everything we have looked at so far, we are now in a position to ask one of the most important questions a student of the Bible in ancient Egypt can. Who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? We will attempt to answer that question in the next video. In the previous video, we considered which 18th dynasty pharaoh was most likely to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. I concluded with two possibilities. If the pharaoh's body was recovered, then my pick for the pharaoh of the Exodus is Thutmose IV. If the pharaoh's body was lost during the sea crossing, then I would suggest that a ruling intermediary during the early years of Amenhotep III's reign was the pharaoh of the Exodus. I favor the former idea because the latter relies on speculation. However, I don't believe the latter can be ruled out due to the possibility that the pharaoh's body was lost in the sea. For the purposes of organizing a timeline, I will regard the Exodus as the event that resulted in the death of Thutmose IV. With this recognition, we can propose a timeline of events for the sojourn of the Israelites in Egypt through the beginning of the time of the Judges. The next question then becomes, who was the pharaoh who oppressed the Israelites? In order to offer a proposal, I first need to refer back to an earlier video I produced about the length of the sojourn. For reasons that I covered in that video, I favor the Septuagint's reading of Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, that the Israelites spent 430 years in Egypt and in Canaan. Thus, this 430-year period refers to the calling of Abraham in Genesis 12 through the giving of the Mosaic Law at Mount Sinai. The result of this is that the time period of the Israelites in Egypt should be understood as roughly 215 years, with a portion of that time being a time flourishing in Goshen, and the remainder as the time of oppression. Genesis chapter 15 verse 16 describes the length of the oppression as, quote, 4 generations. Assuming a Bronze Age generation to be between 20 and 40 years, this would be a time period of 80 to 160 years, somewhere around half to two-thirds of the total sojourn period. When we attempt to identify the pharaoh of the Israelite oppression, this means we are looking for a figure who existed in this length of time prior to the Exodus. Using the end of the reign of Thutmose IV as our starting point, approximately 1400 BC, 80 to 160 years prior would point us to 1480 to 1560 BC as the beginning of the oppression period. The upper end of this scale happens to coincide well with the end of the Second Intermediate Period and the beginning of the 18th dynasty. A little bit of historical background of this time period reveals some interesting circumstances relative to the Bible's testimony. Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period was divided between northern and southern rulers. Dynasties 16 and 17 ruled out of the southern capital of Thebes, modern Luxor. Meanwhile, the north was ruled by dynasties 14 and 15, known to students of Egyptology as the Hyksos. The Hyksos are famous for being ruling dynasties of Semitic-speaking people, whose ancestors likely migrated down from Canaan and Syria during the Middle Kingdom. The collapse of the Middle Kingdom saw a prominent group of these Semitic people acquiesce power in the north out of their capital city, Avaris. The Hyksos dynasties ruled for around 150 to 200 years. Considering a roughly 1400 BC date for the Exodus, this would mean that Joseph would have come to power in the court of one of these Hyksos rulers. There are a lot of things that prove very attractive by locating Joseph and the migration of the Israelites to Goshen during the Hyksos period. But there are also those who raise objections to this. We will look at Joseph in a separate video. For now, I ask that you would please humor this timeline. The latter portion of Hyksos rule saw warfare with the 17th dynasty kings, the native Egyptian rulers from Thebes in the south. The conclusion of this conflict saw the Hyksos rulers expelled from Egypt entirely by a man named Ahmose I. Ahmose would reunify Egypt under a single pharaoh, thus establishing the 18th dynasty. The reign of Ahmose is typically thought to have begun around 1550 BC. His ascension to the throne fits within the upper end of the scale for the period of oppression. Probably as a reaction to the animosity between himself and the Hyksos rulers, Ahmose begins revenge campaigns into Canaan and Syria. It doesn't appear that Ahmose was interested in annexing territory, rather that he was interested only in destroying any remaining Hyksos holdings in the Levant. One thing he does do, though, is bring back captives into slavery in Egypt. This policy would be furthered by the successive pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, who continually raided the Canaanite hill country for slave labor. Some Egyptologists have interpreted these actions as being rooted in a reactionary type of anti-Semitism, the result of the embarrassment of Lower Egypt having been ruled by Semitic peoples, whom the Egyptians referred to as Asiatics, for so long. It's entirely reasonable to conclude that any Semitic people who remained in or around Goshen after the expulsion of the Hyksos would have been made liable to this type of treatment as well. Egypt not wanting to allow any possibility for foreign rule again. If we overlay this with the testimony of Exodus chapter 1, a few things stand out immediately. First, if Joseph rose to power in the court of a Hyksos king, then it is unlikely that Ahmose would, quote, know of him. The Hebrew of know in verse 8 is yadah. Two possible interpretations of this verse arise. Number one, the pharaoh did not know about Joseph, or number two, the pharaoh did not regard or respect Joseph. Ahmose is a good candidate for either interpretation. If Joseph was in power about 75 to 100 years before Ahmose in the north, he may very well have not known who he was. If Ahmose did know who Joseph was, then it's likely that he would have no respect for him or the things he did for the Hyksos rulers. Second, the combination of Ahmose's vengeful attitudes with his paranoia over Egyptian sovereignty could very easily have led him to issue a decree similar to that recorded in verses 9 and 10. Finally, verse 11 describes the cities that the Israelites were put into forced labor to build as store cities. In other words, these weren't cities that were populated by common citizens. They were established for the purpose of storing goods and raw materials. Subsequent to his overthrow of the Hyksos, Ahmose largely depopulated their former capital city, Avaris. He did, however, initiate the building of, quote, enormous storage facilities, among them numerous silos, end quote, probably as a launchpad for Egyptian military expeditions into the Levant. Before this, Avaris was a metropolitan area, densely populated with Hyksos aristocracy. If Ramses in Exodus 1:11 is a redacted place name for Avaris, as we have previously proposed, then this becomes another synchronism we can use to link the biblical timeline with Egyptian chronology. Some alternative candidates present themselves in the form of Ahmose's two successors, Amenhotep I and Thutmose I. Amenhotep I probably still being close enough to the Hyksos expulsion to have held on to the same hostilities as his father. Thutmose I being the first 18th dynasty pharaoh who aspired to Egyptian hegemony over the Levant. Still, I find Ahmose to be the most likely, though he lies toward the upper end of the scale for the beginning of the oppression period. Many circumstances of his reign accord well with the Bible's testimony. Now that we have proposed a pharaoh of the Exodus and a pharaoh of the oppression, we can propose an overall timeline of events from Israel's migration into Goshen through the conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua. We will do so in the next video. In the previous video, we engaged in a brief analysis of a Middle Kingdom date for the Exodus, as presented in the documentary Patterns of Evidence and the works of David Rohl. While this position shares some of the same concerns as those I have raised in this series, at this point I am not persuaded that the Middle Kingdom is the appropriate time in Egypt's history to look for evidence of the Exodus. As such, I will proceed in this series assuming a traditional early date, during the 18th dynasty as the most likely for the Exodus. Given everything we have looked at so far, we are now in a position to ask one of the most important questions a student of the Bible and ancient Egypt can. Who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? There are four main assumptions I will be using to offer my opinion. Number one, the variant readings of 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 support 480 and 440 years prior to Solomon as round numbers. For our purposes, a time period of roughly 1450 to 1400 BC. Number two, a standard deviation of roughly 5 to 50 years in the dates of traditional Egyptian chronology. Number three, that the Exodus resulted in Egypt's inability to exercise economic and military control of the Levant. And number 4, that the Habiru of the Amarna letters refer, at least in part, to the Israelite conquest during the reign of Akhenaten. For substance to any of these assumptions, please refer to the earlier videos of this series. Before we go any further, though, we should discuss another important assumption: that the body of the pharaoh was lost in the Yam Suf, the Red Sea. I realize that this is a frequent point of argument when attempting to identify the pharaoh of the Exodus, so I wanted to take a minute to address it. I believe that there is enough in the Exodus account to support Pharaoh being drowned in the sea along with his army. Egyptian custom would have been for the pharaoh to personally lead his troops, so I think it's fair to consider the reference to all of Pharaoh's army having perished as including him also. This leads many to believe that Pharaoh's body would have been irretrievably lost. However, Exodus chapter 14 verse 30 states that Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. The question that would arise from this is whether or not Pharaoh's body would have been among those that washed up on the shore. I cannot give a definitive answer either way. There is enough ambiguity in Exodus chapter 14, though, for us to at least consider the possibility that Pharaoh's body could have been recovered as one that washed up on the shore. Thus, a common objection that, since we have the body of the pharaoh, he can't be the pharaoh of the Exodus, may not necessarily be true. In presenting this video, I will therefore try to be open to either possibility: that Pharaoh's body was recovered posthumously, or that it was irretrievably lost in the sea. With that being said, let's now begin to narrow our search. The variant readings of 1 Kings 6:1 point us to approximately 1450 to 1400 BC as the time of the Exodus events. Acknowledging 480 and 440 respectively to be round numbers, there may even be room to extend this time period to roughly 1460 to 1390 BC, although I admit that may be pushing the issue. When we examine the traditional chronologies of Egyptian history, 3 pharaohs emerge as reigning in or around these dates: Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and Thutmose IV. These pharaohs are bookended by Hatshepsut and Amenhotep III. Right away, we can rule out Hatshepsut, since the biblical text consistently refers to Pharaoh as a man, Hatshepsut being a female pharaoh. The current dates for the remaining candidate pharaohs are as follows: Thutmose III, 1458 to 1425 BC, Amenhotep II, 1427 to 1397 BC, Thutmose IV, 1397 to 1388 BC, and Amenhotep III, 1388 to 1351 BC. By these dates, the strongest candidate for the 480 years of the Masoretic reading of 1 Kings 6:1 is Thutmose III. The range of standard chronological deviation would make Amenhotep II a plausible alternative according to this reading. In contrast, Amenhotep II is the strongest candidate for the 440 years of the Septuagint's reading. Thutmose IV is a plausible alternative even by conventional dates, with standard chronological deviation only strengthening his case. Amenhotep III, though an outlier by traditional dates, could be considered a second alternative by chronological deviation. Now that we have established the likelihood of each pharaoh being that of the Exodus by chronology, let's examine the state of Egypt during each of their reigns for evidence of economic and military weakness. Even though an exact interpretation of the 480 years of the Masoretic reading of 1 Kings 6:1 lands during the reign of Thutmose III, we can almost immediately rule him out as the pharaoh of the Exodus. The reason is that Thutmose III is arguably the strongest ruler in all of ancient Egyptian history. Rather than there being evidence of weakness in the wake of his reign, Egypt is at the height of its imperial power and influence. If the Exodus occurred at the end of his reign, Egypt would not be as strong and wealthy as it was. Amenhotep II has historically been a popular candidate for those advocating an early date of the Exodus. Reason being that the high chronology of Egypt has typically placed him on the throne during the year 1446 BC, the date supported by an exact interpretation of 1 Kings 6:1 in the Masoretic. Even in the current chronology, he does have the support of the exact interpretation of the Septuagint's reading. The first 2 years of his reign were a co-regency with his father, Thutmose III, which further rules out Thutmose III as the Exodus pharaoh. An interesting point to consider is that his successor, Thutmose IV, does not appear to have been in line for the throne upon Amenhotep II's death, as evidenced by the dream stela erected between the paws of the Great Sphinx of Giza. Advocates of Amenhotep II as the Exodus pharaoh point to this as substance that Amenhotep II lost his firstborn son, as described in Exodus chapter 12, verse 29. When we examine the state of Egypt in the wake of his reign, however, we find that Egypt's power and influence has not diminished. This is substantiated by the treaty that Thutmose IV established with the king of the Mitanni, Artatama I, to fix Egypt's northern border. If the Exodus occurred at the end of the reign of Amenhotep II, it is unlikely that Egypt would be economically or militarily strong enough to have negotiated this. For this reason, despite his popularity for some, I do not believe Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. The reign of Thutmose IV is considered by some Egyptologists as the height of Egypt's imperial power, because of the aforementioned treaty with the Mitanni. As mentioned in part 6 of this series, though, some interesting circumstances take place following his time on the throne. To recap, the death of Thutmose IV was apparently premature. Examination of his mummy has led scholars to assume a time of death between 25 and 28 years of age, free from indications of disease or other trauma. However, a curious observation is that he was emaciated at the time of his death. For whatever reason, Thutmose IV was not eating well in his last days. Given that there are no other signs of disease, perhaps he was under a large amount of stress, as one would expect of the pharaoh who witnessed God's wrath poured out in the destruction of Egypt during the 10 plagues. It's in the wake of his reign that Egypt begins losing control of its Levantine territories during the reign of his successor, Amenhotep III, ultimately resulting in the subjugation of Egypt's number one ally, the kingdom of the Mitanni, by the Hittites during the reign of his grandson, Akhenaten. It is unlikely that Thutmose IV could be considered as a candidate by even a round reading of 1 Kings 6:1 in the Masoretic. However, he is a very good candidate by a round reading of the Septuagint. Another interesting point is that if Thutmose IV is the pharaoh of the Exodus, the duration of Amenhotep III's reign is between 37 and 38 years, the amount of time Israel wandered in the desert before the first generation of Israelites passed away. It's in the wake of Amenhotep III's 38 years of rule that the mentions of the Habiru in Canaan appear during the reign of Akhenaten, which would match up quite well with Joshua's conquest. For these reasons, I believe a strong case can be made for Thutmose IV being the pharaoh of the Exodus. Amenhotep III's case is the most unlikely based on chronology. His best bet in this regard is as a second alternate for the Septuagint reading. However, the circumstances of his reign are attractive for similar reasons as they are for Thutmose IV. Egypt becomes increasingly weak during this time, and his son's reign would roughly coincide with the time of the conquest under Joshua. A weakness for his candidacy, though, is that these events happened prior to his death. If the Exodus took place during his reign, this would mean that he did not perish in the sea crossing. However, let me propose a possible resolution to this. Recall that the premature death of Thutmose IV likely meant that Amenhotep III ascended to the throne as a child. If this were the case, he would be pharaoh in title only, as Egypt would be ruled by intermediaries until he matured enough to rule of his own accord. Perhaps, then, it's possible that one of Thutmose IV's viziers was the acting pharaoh during this time. If the Exodus occurred during the early years of Amenhotep III, while he was a child, it may have been this hypothetical official who was the pharaoh of the Exodus. This is all speculative, but if one is going to propose Amenhotep III's reign as the time of the Exodus, I think this is the most reasonable way to accord it with the historical record. Given everything we examined, I will offer two proposals for the pharaoh of the Exodus. The first being in the event that the pharaoh's body was recovered, and the second being that it was lost in the sea crossing. If the pharaoh's body was recovered, then my pick for the pharaoh of the Exodus is Thutmose IV. Prior to his reign, Egypt is powerful and stable. In the wake of his reign, Egypt quickly becomes weak and impotent. The record of Amenhotep III's reign and the Amarna letters during the reign of Akhenaten accord well with the biblical narrative and make for synchronisms that don't work with any other proposed pharaoh. If the pharaoh's body was lost, then I would suggest that a ruling intermediary during the early years of Amenhotep III's reign was the pharaoh of the Exodus. I believe that the synchronisms we see with the end of Thutmose IV's reign are too strong to be pushed forward beyond the early years of Amenhotep III. This means, though, that he would have been a child and likely not acting as pharaoh for some time. The result is that another individual was the acting pharaoh in this sequence of events, and it would have been this person who met their demise in the Exodus. Of these two ideas, I favor the former because the latter relies on speculation. However, I don't believe the latter can be ruled out due to the possibility that the pharaoh's body was lost in the sea. For the purposes of organizing a timeline, I will regard the Exodus as the event that resulted in the death of Thutmose IV. With this recognition, we can propose a timeline of events for the sojourn of the Israelites in Egypt through the beginning of the time of the Judges. The next question then becomes, who was the pharaoh who oppressed the Israelites? We will offer some proposals in the next video. We began this series of videos with consideration of the comments of Professor Israel Finkelstein.
The attempts to locate the events in the 13th century BC in the time of Pharaoh Ramses II have faced insurmountable difficulties. There is no mention of such an event in any New Kingdom source. There is no trace of the early Hebrews in Egypt. The northern coast of Sinai was protected by formidable Egyptian forts, which could have easily prevented an escaping people from crossing the desert. There is no trace of late bronze remains in the rest of the Sinai Peninsula, not even in a place like Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites are supposed to have camped for a long time. And Canaan of that time was an Egyptian province administered by Egyptian garrisons, where 50 Egyptian soldiers were enough to pacify an area according to the Amarna letters. Finally, many of the places mentioned in the story of Exodus and the wandering in the desert were not inhabited before the 8th or even 7th centuries BC.
Since then, we have examined the assumptions that led Finkelstein and other scholars to look for evidence of the Exodus in the 13th century BC, during the reign of Ramses II. We have weighed these assumptions against the testimony of the Bible and the historical record, and come to the conclusion that the Exodus should be understood as having occurred in or around 1450 to 1400 BC, during Egypt's 18th dynasty. We've even gone so far as to propose candidates for the pharaoh who oppressed the Israelites, the pharaoh of the Exodus itself, and the expected fallout in Egypt. Our response would be incomplete if we didn't offer an alternative to the statement of Professor Finkelstein. First, let me say that I wholeheartedly agree with what he has said. The Exodus did not take place in the 13th century BC. However, instead of simply saying that this recognition means that the Exodus didn't take place at all, the question should be, when did the Exodus and the events of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt take place? I will be building upon the arguments I have laid out over the course of the previous videos. If there is a position I present that you would like more information on, then I will refer you back to my prior work. Our starting place will be the Exodus itself. My proposal is that the Exodus was the event that ended the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose IV, resulting in the subsequent decline and collapse of the 18th dynasty, as evidenced by Egyptian apathy towards their Levantine vassals and allies from the reigns of Amenhotep III through Ai. This means the approximate date for the Exodus is 1400 BC by contemporary chronology. Scripturally, this favors the Septuagint's reading of 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 as the proper date. That the Exodus occurred 440 years before the 4th year of Solomon, rather than 480 years as found in the Masoretic text. Following the Exodus, the Israelites wandered in the desert of the Arabian Peninsula for 38 years, roughly 1362 BC, before the first generation of people had passed away. This parallels the approximately 38-year reign of Amenhotep III, the time where Egyptian hegemony over Canaan and Syria was waning. Joshua's conquest would have begun in the 2nd year of the reign of Akhenaten, roughly 1360 BC, whose reign is contemporary with the attacks of the, quote, Habiru against former Egyptian vassals in the Levant, as documented in the Amarna letters. I propose, therefore, that the Israelites were one of the many groups designated as Habiru by the nations of the ancient Near East. Perhaps it is from this designation that the term Hebrew would later arise, the Israelites being the most well-established group of the former Habiru. It would also be around 1360 BC that Jericho falls in this timeline. Going backwards, we will use the short sojourn timeline as described in the Septuagint reading of Exodus chapter 12 verse 40 and affirmed by the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 3 verse 17. That the 430 years encompasses the calling of Abraham in Genesis 12 through the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. Thus, quote, your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, is the time of the patriarchs in Canaan, which precedes the time where, quote, they will be enslaved and oppressed in Egypt. Assuming both of these periods to be relatively equal, we're looking for approximately 215 years for each. With the Exodus and Sinai taking place in around 1400 BC, this places Abraham's departure from Haran in approximately 1830 BC. This means that the pharaoh that Abraham encountered was one of the 12th dynasty pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, perhaps Sesostris III or Amenemhet III. God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15 takes place 400 years prior to the Exodus, approximately 1800 BC. The 4th generation prophesied in verse 16 is the 4th generation of oppressed Israelites in Egypt, rather than the 4th generation after Abraham. Assuming a generation to be 20 to 40 years of age, we have a start of the oppression period between 80 to 160 years before the Exodus. Placing the Exodus at about 1400 BC at the close of the reign of Thutmose IV reveals a prime candidate for the pharaoh of the oppression in Ahmose I, the man who expelled the Semitic Hyksos rulers from Avaris and established the 18th dynasty. It was he who would institute a policy of Canaanite slave raiding, likely also enslaving any remaining Semitic people living in the delta region of Egypt, and would convert Avaris into a store city. If these events are those recorded in Exodus chapter 1, then the oppression of the Israelites begins with the start of the 18th dynasty, around 1550 BC, and lasts for 150 or so years. This leaves us with locating Joseph's time in Egypt and Israel's migration into Goshen. Assuming, again, that the 430 years in Egypt and Canaan should be understood as evenly split, then we're looking for the migration to take place around 215 years before the Exodus. This points us to about 1615 BC, right in the middle of Egypt's 15th dynasty, the last of the Hyksos rulers in Avaris. Joseph, therefore, enters Egypt as a slave around 1630 BC and rises to prominence in the court of one of the Hyksos kings. According to this timeline, our final dates are as follows. Abraham leaves Haran in approximately 1830 BC. He enters Egypt during the 12th dynasty. He covenants with God in approximately 1800 BC. Joseph is sold into slavery prior to 1630 BC. He is brought into the court of a Hyksos pharaoh in roughly 1615 BC. Ahmose I, in other words, the pharaoh who did not know Joseph, enslaves the Israelites at the beginning of the 18th dynasty in 1550 BC. Moses is born approximately 1480 BC, possibly during the reign of Thutmose II or Hatshepsut. This would have him being raised alongside Thutmose III, while his flight from Egypt to Midian at 40 years old would have occurred in the middle of Thutmose III's reign, roughly 1440 BC. Thutmose III then would be the pharaoh who died while Moses was in exile. If this timeline is correct, then the reign of Amenhotep II would have come and gone during Moses' exile without the Bible's mention. Moses returns to Egypt with Aaron at age 80 in about 1400 BC to stand before Thutmose IV and lead the Israelites out of slavery. The Israelites then wander in the Arabian desert for 38 years through roughly 1362 BC, during the reign of Amenhotep III, until the first generation of Israelites have died. Moses dies in about 1360 BC, in the second year of Akhenaten, and Joshua begins the conquest of Canaan, starting with Jericho at this time. Admittedly, this timeline is not without points of contention or questions of interpretation. For example, there are only about 65 years between the ascensions of Joseph and Ahmose I. If Joseph was 30 at his ascension and 110 at his death, then there should be at least 80 years between his ascension and the ascension of Ahmose I. The language of Exodus intimates that there may have been a length of time in between Joseph's death and the pharaoh of the oppression as well. Some scholars, however, suggest that Joseph's 110 years of age is an idealized figure rather than a literal one, based upon evidence of the Egyptians commemorating important dignitaries with an age of 110 years. If Joseph was remembered domestically as a national hero for his efforts in the famine, perhaps this age was attributed to him out of reverence, according to the Egyptian tradition. Also, there are customs ascribed to Joseph that appear to coincide better with a pharaoh of native Egyptian heritage rather than one of the Hyksos. Genesis chapter 41 verse 14 records that Joseph shaved before appearing to Pharaoh. Native Egyptians were clean-shaven for hygienic reasons. In contrast, Canaanites, Semites, and other Asiatics are traditionally depicted in Egyptian art with facial hair. Verse 45 of this chapter describes Pharaoh giving Joseph an Egyptian name. Genesis chapter 43 verse 42 records that Joseph did not eat with his brothers because, quote, the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is loathsome to the Egyptians. At face value, these things may be indications that Joseph came to power under a native Egyptian pharaoh, the implication being that Joseph's time in Egypt would need to predate the Second Intermediate Period, when Egypt maintained native rule in the Delta region. Arguing against this position, though, is the mention of Pharaoh's chariot in Genesis 41, verse 43. It is widely agreed that the Egyptians were introduced to the chariot by the Hyksos rulers, not having had them previously. Thus, if Joseph were a product of the Middle Kingdom, the mention of Pharaoh's chariot would be an anachronism. We'll discuss the dating of Joseph specifically in a future video. There are other issues that are worth discussing that we don't have time to cover in this video. For any outstanding questions of interpretation or contentions that may be present in this timeline, my aim was to offer a proposed ballpark for interested parties to consider as an alternative to the standard interpretations espoused among skeptical scholarship for a 13th century BC Exodus. If you have enjoyed this series of videos, or if you have found the information we've discussed valuable, please leave a thumbs up and click the subscribe button to stay up to date on my newest content. For further reading on this subject, I have included a list of books in the description box below. The Israelites' crossing of the Red Sea is one of the most spectacular and pivotal events in the Bible. The Red Sea is the body of water that separates the East African coast from the Arabian subcontinent. At its northern end, the Red Sea is divided between two gulfs, flanking the Sinai Peninsula, the Gulf of Suez in the west and the Gulf of Aqaba in the east. For many centuries, Bible scholars and lay believers have speculated where along this vast expanse of water that the Exodus crossing took place. In more recent times, though, there has been a rise in speculation that the Exodus crossing did not take place in the Red Sea at all, but rather in a, quote, sea of reeds, usually interpreted to mean an inland lake somewhere along the northeast border of ancient Egypt. This topic has proven to be quite volatile, with passionate defenses made by champions of both interpretations. With the larger academic community remaining steadfast in their skepticism of the events of the Exodus, a proper understanding of what the Bible is communicating about where the Israelites crossed a body of water to secure their flight from the oppression of the Egyptians is fundamental to both a sound defense of Scripture as well as any future discoveries that may take place. First, the term that historically has been translated as Red Sea is Yam Suf. Yam means sea, however Suf does not mean red. The Hebrew word for red is Adom. Suf is typically understood to mean reed. Part of the reason for this is that the first occurrence of Suf in the Bible is in Exodus chapter 2, verse 3, where the infant Moses is placed Ba-Suf, in the reeds of the Nile. If you watched my video on unicorns in the Bible, you'll recall that I talked about cognate words, words that are borrowed from another related language. With the development of Egyptology over the last 200 years, many scholars have come to believe the Hebrew word suf is a cognate word deriving from the ancient Egyptian word tufi, which also means reed. The argument then follows that since the original Egyptian word meant reed, that the same definition should be applied to the Hebrew suf. Given that the Red Sea, whether the sea proper or either of the gulfs, are not particularly reedy, those who emphasize the Egyptian context of tufi believe it is more appropriate to identify the Yam Suf with one of the inland lakes along Egypt's border with Sinai, or perhaps an ancient lagoon that existed along the Mediterranean coast. But if Yam Suf does not mean Red Sea, why has this been the traditional translation? When the Old Testament was translated into Greek, the translators used the phrase Eruthra Thalassa to translate Yam Suf. Eruthra Thalassa means Red Sea, so the Greek is the source of the traditional translation. A number of people have argued that this is simply a mistranslation on the part of the Greek translators that has managed to stick with the passage of time. However, there are some other portions of the biblical text that need to be considered before jumping to this conclusion. The Bible provides a geographical understanding of Yam Suf in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 26. King Solomon also built a fleet of ships in Ezion-Geber, which is near Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. First, the phrase Red Sea in this verse is the same as Yam Suf that occurs across the rest of Scripture. This is undisputed. Second, there are two landmarks the Bible gives that help locate Yam Suf, the cities of Ezion-Geber and Eloth. These are port cities along the northern coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, the eastern branch of the Red Sea. The Gulf of Aqaba was the southern border of ancient Edom, as well as the Israelite kingdom under the united monarchy of Saul, David, and Solomon. Again, these locations are also undisputed. Further, Exodus chapter 23, verse 31 establishes Yam Suf as a border for the kingdom of Israel. The quote Sea of the Philistines is the Mediterranean. Thus, the only other body of water that bordered Israel was the Gulf of Aqaba along its southern terminus. Before we simply say that the designation of Yam Suf as Red Sea is a mistranslation, we must consider the significance of the fact that the only places in the Bible that provide detailed geographical context for Yam Suf are actually in reference to a portion of the Red Sea. Beyond this, there are additional geographical clues the Bible gives us as to the location of Yam Suf. Remember that after Moses fled from Egypt, he lived with the family of his father-in-law Jethro in Midian. It was during his stay in Midian that Moses encountered the angel of the Lord in the burning bush on Mount Sinai. The location of ancient Midian is widely thought to have been along the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula. This would mean that the most likely location of Mount Sinai is also somewhere in this area. The Apostle Paul confirms as much when he said in Galatians chapter 4, verse 25 that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. To be fair, the ancient understanding of Arabia should not be confused with the modern borders of Saudi Arabia. However, given the weight of the entire biblical testimony, a location for Mount Sinai in modern Saudi Arabia appears the most probable. Thus, if Mount Sinai is somewhere along the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, the nearest sea is the Gulf of Aqaba, especially the nearest sea which would have provided a natural barrier for the Israelites to be protected from any harassment by the Egyptians. These observations are the fuel for the debate over the location of the Sea of the Exodus. Generally speaking, Egyptologists maintain that the Yam Suf must be a marshy inland lake on the basis of the etymology of the ancient Egyptian word tufi for the Hebrew suf as reed. On the other hand, Bible scholars maintain that the Yam Suf must be understood according to the biblical testimony of this body of water being identified as the Gulf of Aqaba. So, who's right? As I've said in my video on the sojourn of Israel in Egypt, there are good, learned, believing men and women who represent both sides of this discussion, so I don't expect my opinion to be conclusive. As previously, though, also, I will not leave you with this lame politically correct answer. With consideration to those Egyptologists and other scholars who favor an inland lakes location for Yam Suf, they do acknowledge that the location for this body of water described in 1 Kings 9:26 is the Gulf of Aqaba. But if they can recognize this, why do they still argue for a different location as the place of the Exodus crossing? I believe the answer to this is that many of these scholars are holding to an erroneous assumption about how the Bible uses Yam Suf. Consider the words of Professor James Hoffmeyer, a believing Egyptologist who holds to an inland crossing site. It is true that Yam Suf refers not only to the sea crossed by the Israelites during the Exodus from Egypt, but also to the Gulf of Aqaba. Yam Suf is used in Hebrew for the sea through which the Israelites passed, the Gulf of Suez, and the Gulf of Aqaba. I have a lot of respect for Professor Hoffmeyer, and I am very thankful for his work. However, I believe his statement begs the question, how do we know that Yam Suf is being used in reference to multiple bodies of water? The only verses among all of those listed here that provide an exact location of Yam Suf are 1 Kings 9:26 and Exodus 23:31. To his credit, Deuteronomy chapters 1 and 2 do strongly infer that Yam Suf is the Gulf of Aqaba also, given that these references are post-Exodus. But there is nothing in Numbers chapter 33 verses 10 and 11 to suggest that this reference to Yam Suf is actually to the Gulf of Suez. Further, there isn't anything to suggest that the references in Exodus 13:18, 15:4, and Joshua 24:6 are to be understood as yet another body of water. The only way one would come to this conclusion is if they approach the text with these ideas already assumed. If we rely solely on the text, we read all of these references to Yam Suf as the Gulf of Aqaba, and there is nothing present in the text that would contradict this understanding. I believe this is the fatal flaw of the Sea of Reeds interpretation. It forces the reader to assume an Egyptian understanding of words rather than a Hebrew one. I am not arguing that Suf is derived from Tufi, or that either word is used in reference to reeds or other types of vegetation. However, what I am arguing is that it is inappropriate to restrict the semantic domain of the Hebrew Suf to mean strictly reeds, on the basis of how the ancient Egyptians used the word Tufi. The reason it is inappropriate is because this does not allow the biblical authors to use Suf in the ways that they do. While Suf is used in Exodus chapter 2 verse 3 to describe the hiding place of baby Moses among the reeds of the Nile, to fully grasp the Bible's use of this word, we must consider other passages that utilize the Suf word family. The Hebrew language is organized around word families. A given root will be the base for subsequent noun and verb forms. Certain words within a given family will have particular definitions, but these definitions are tied to the generic definition found in the root. With this understanding, we can look at other passages of Scripture wherein a word from the Suf family is used and see how the authors use this word to communicate. The verbal form of Suf is found in Esther 9:28, Psalm 73:19, Isaiah 66:17, Jeremiah 8:13, and Amos 3:15. Additionally, the Aramaic cognate of Suf is found in Daniel chapter 2 verse 44 and chapter 4 verse 33. In all of these passages, the verbal form of Suf is used to communicate the end, fulfillment, consumption, or destruction of the object in question. For this reason, the basic definition of the verbal form of Suf is to come to an end, or to cease. With respect to the noun forms, there is a related form, soph, which occurs as both a Hebrew word and an Aramaic cognate. These verses utilize soph to describe an end, either a physical or temporal boundary or limit. Another noun within the Suf family, sufa, is used to describe a storm or whirlwind, with the implication here being that the storm is the agent of destruction or end of the object in question. Returning to Exodus chapter 2 verse 3 with the greater context of the Suf family in mind, an understanding put forth by some linguists is that Suf refers to reeds insofar as the reeds are present at the boundary or end of the river along its bank. In other words, the emphasis of Suf is not so much on the reed itself, rather that it is an object that marks the end of the river. If this understanding is accurate, then a more appropriate translation of the phrase Yam Suf would be sea of the end, sea of destruction, or sea of the boundary. Any of these definitions fits well with the biblical narrative. Sea of the end or sea of destruction accords with the end and destruction of the Egyptian army when the water drowned them. There is no need to imply a marshy inland lake in this case, which leaves the Gulf of Aqaba as a candidate for the Yam Suf the Israelites crossed to freedom. Sea of the boundary would imply Yam Suf as the southern boundary of the Kingdom of Israel, the space occupied by the Gulf of Aqaba. It is likely that this understanding lies behind why the Greek translators of the Old Testament chose to render Yam Suf as Urethra Thalassa, Red Sea, not because they were attempting to literally translate Yam Suf, but because they were attempting to place the body of water that Yam Suf was in reference to. This is why I disagree with the notion that Yam Suf implies a marshy inland lake somewhere in the northeast region of Egypt. To define Yam Suf in this way assumes a native Egyptian reference rather than a biblical Hebrew reference. Again, I'm not disputing that the Egyptian Patufi means Sea of Reeds, or that it has a cognate relationship to Yam Suf. What I am disputing, though, is the idea that the Egyptian meaning must be the strict understanding of the Hebrew word, rather than allowing Hebrew to define its own semantic domain for Suf. When the Hebrews incorporated Suf into their vocabulary, the reference to reeds found in the Egyptian context served as the basis for the word to be used in reference to ends or boundaries of physical and temporal objects, reeds being a natural boundary marker. Some, however, point to Exodus chapter 10, verse 19 as proof that Yam Suf must, at least once, be referring to a local body of water near Egypt. In reference to the eighth plague, the plague of locusts, the Bible says the Lord changed the wind to a very strong west wind that carried off the locusts and blew them into the Yam Suf, the Red Sea. The charge is that the, quote, west wind that carried the locusts, quote, into the Yam Suf is coming from the wrong direction to carry them to the Gulf of Aqaba, which is to the east of Egypt. Therefore, if there is a Yam Suf to the west of Egypt, this is proof the phrase is being used in reference to multiple bodies of water. As a result, this ambiguity is then carried forward to reinforce a local inland lake's crossing site. As strong as this case appears to be, the Hebrew of Exodus 10:19 gives us clarity. The phrase that is traditionally translated as west wind is ruach yam. You'll notice that the word rendered west is yam, the word for sea. The semantic domain for the Yam word family includes both references to the sea and to a westerly direction. The reason for this is because the most prominent sea in the biblical world was the Mediterranean, which provided the western border of Canaan and later Israel. Thus, Yam can be spoken of either in reference to something in the west or a sea. A legitimate alternative translation of Exodus 10:19 is a very strong wind from the sea, literally sea wind. So, how do we know which interpretation is correct? The answer is context. The first uses of Yam in reference to west are found in Genesis chapter 12 verse 8 and chapter 13 verse 4, during Abraham's time in Canaan, bordered on the west by the Mediterranean Sea. However, Exodus 10:19 is set in Egypt, not Canaan. The Mediterranean represents Egypt's northern border. There is no body of water that borders Egypt to the west, either today or in biblical times. For this reason, I believe it is more appropriate to translate Exodus 10:19 as a strong wind from the sea, rather than a strong westerly wind. Substance to this interpretation is found in the Septuagint's rendering of this verse. And the Lord brought in the opposite direction a strong wind from the sea. Further, the Hebrew doesn't necessitate the idea that the locusts were actually blown, quote, into the Yam Suf. The reason for this is that the preposition for to or into is not present in the text. All the Hebrew says is Wayit kaehu Yamasuf, and blew them Yam Suf. It could be that this choice of words means the locusts were drowned in the Yam Suf, but it is equally plausible, if not more so, that this phrase means only in the direction of the Yam Suf. Here then is a proposed translation of Exodus 10:19. And the Lord turned a very strong wind from the sea and took away the locusts and blew them toward or in the direction of the Yam Suf. If this is the proper reading of the verse, then it does not pose any problems to understanding that Yam Suf refers exclusively to the Gulf of Aqaba. In addition, as previously stated, there was no body of water to the west of Egypt. Thus, the rendering of Yam as west does not make sense on geographical grounds either. With all of this being said, I believe that the only body of water we should consider as the crossing site of the Exodus is the Gulf of Aqaba. It is the only body of water that the Bible specifically identifies by geography in reference to Yam Suf. All other references to Yam Suf must be subject to the clear identification of the Gulf of Aqaba as the Sea of Yam Suf. If you are familiar with the narratives of Genesis and Exodus, you will know about the sojourn of Israel in ancient Egypt. The sojourn encompasses the time period from the migration of Jacob's family into Goshen under Joseph through the Exodus under Moses. In speaking of this period, the Bible says in Exodus chapter 12, verses 40 and 41, the time that the sons of Israel had lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions went out of the land of Egypt. Thus, if you listen to most sermons or lectures regarding the sojourn, 430 years is generally proclaimed as the amount of time Israel spent in Egypt. If you watched my video about Goliath's height, you will recall that the Hebrew source of our modern English Old Testament is the Masoretic text. You will also recall that the Masoretic text is not our only witness to the textual tradition of the Hebrew Bible, that we also have other sources from ancient times, primarily the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. As I explored in reference to Goliath's height, occasionally these textual witnesses exhibit subtle differences from one another. These differences are called textual variants. It just so happens that Exodus chapter 12 verse 40 is also a textual variant. Here is the reading of this verse from the Greek Septuagint. The sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, was 430 years. The phrase "and the land of Canaan" is not present in the Masoretic text. Though it may seem like a minor difference to the lay believer, the consequence of this variant influences when we should be looking for the events of the sojourn in the historical record of ancient Egypt. Should we be looking for a 430-year presence of the Israelites in Egypt, or should we be looking for a roughly 215-year presence? Given that the historicity of the events described in the sojourn are under attack by both lay and academic unbelievers, it's important that we have a right understanding of the Bible's testimony of these events. Thus, how do we know whether this is an addendum or the original reading of this passage? In the case of Goliath's height, we had an additional source in the form of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The testimony of the Dead Sea Scrolls carries a lot of weight because, number one, they are at least as old as the Septuagint, if not older, and two, they are written in Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament. Unfortunately, the readings of Exodus contained among the Dead Sea Scrolls are fragmentary. As a result, a full reading of Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 is missing from them. So, we can't appeal to them to help us figure out which reading is more likely to be original. However, we do have another clue we can refer to, this time from the New Testament. In Galatians chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, Paul, speaking of the relationship of those approaching God on the basis of the law with those who do so on the basis of faith, says, "The promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed." The scripture does not say "and to seeds," meaning many, but "and to your seed," meaning one, who is Christ. What I mean is this: The law that came 430 years later does not revoke the covenant previously established by God, so as to nullify the promise. Here, Paul makes reference to the giving of the Mosaic Law, which occurred after the Exodus, as having taken place 430 years after the time of Abraham. If the length of the sojourn itself, from Joseph to Moses, was 430 years, as the Masoretic text states, then Paul's reference would be too short. It appears then that Paul was assuming the reading of Exodus 12:40 found in the Septuagint, that the 430 years refers not only to the sojourn in Egypt, but also to the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Canaan that happened previous to the sojourn. To be fair, there has been and continues to be debate among Christian scholars as to why Paul assumed the Septuagint's reading. Was it because this was the original reading of the Hebrew of this verse? Or was it simply because he wanted to use the Septuagint because that is the translation the Gentiles coming into the church would have used? Though they possess less authority because they are either not Scripture themselves or they are a translation not utilized by the authors of the New Testament, there are a few other sources we can examine. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus says that the Israelites left Egypt 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt. A later witness comes in the form of the Samaritan Pentateuch, written in the 14th century, which takes the same reading as the Septuagint, though the late composition of this manuscript makes it unlikely to be an authoritative witness of the original text. A couple of other biblical passages must also be considered to help us shed light on the original reading of Exodus 12:40. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, God tells Abraham that, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. The big question in regards to this verse is whether or not God is speaking of one or two events. Is, quote, being strangers in a land that is not theirs, the same event as, quote, being enslaved and oppressed, or is it a preceding event? Proponents of the long 430-year sojourn see them as one and the same, while those of a 215-year sojourn see them as sequential. The Apostle Paul also has some more relevant words in Acts chapter 13, verses 17 through 20. The God of this people Israel chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt, and with an uplifted arm he led them out from it. For a period of about 40 years he put up with them in the wilderness. When he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he distributed their land as an inheritance, all of which took about 450 years. Again, it appears that Paul is assuming the Septuagint reading as he did in Galatians chapter 3, verse 17, because he includes God's choosing of the patriarchs in the same 450 years as the sojourn in Egypt and the 40 years wandering in the desert. There are those who maintain, though, that Paul's 450 years should be ascribed only to the sojourn in Egypt and the wandering period. Now, what do I think? There are good, learned people who represent both sides of this discussion, and I don't expect my opinion to be the conclusive one. However, that's a lame, politically correct answer that you did not click on this video for. Personally, I believe that a 215-year sojourn better reconciles the 400 years of Genesis 15:13 with the 430 years of Exodus 12:40. If we account for the 430 years of Exodus as including the life of Abraham, then we can acknowledge that some of those years have already passed by the time God covenants with him. Thus, it would be 400 years from the time of the covenant, but 430 years from the events of Genesis 12, when Abraham left Haran. I could be wrong, but this makes a little more sense to me than simply saying that the 400 years of Genesis 15:13 is a round figure, while the 430 years of Exodus is the precise figure, as some scholars who advocate a 430-year sojourn do. I also advocate the Septuagint's reading because I believe Paul, given his education, would have been well aware of any textual streams that would have been around during his lifetime. Thus, if there was a textual variant at Exodus 12:40 during the first century, he would be in a position to speak on which one was authoritative. This being said, his reference to the Septuagint is evidence of one of two things. Number one, the Hebrew reading of Exodus 12:40 during the first century was the same as the Septuagint. In other words, there was no variant reading. Or number two, he was inspired to know which variant of Exodus 12:40 was the original one. Again, I'm open to correction, but these are my thoughts. The big takeaway from all this is that the reading of Exodus chapter 12 verse 40 has large implications, both for the biblical timeline as well as the overall historical timeline more generally. The groundwork of our attempts to understand the history of Israel before, during, and after their sojourn in Egypt is to accurately discern the biblical parameters of these events. For more information on this topic, I recommend Let My People Go by Dr. Stephen Collins and On the Reliability of the Old Testament by Kenneth Kitchen. You will find links to each of these books in the description.